I have never said that the executive should never exceed his powers. Jefferson did so in the case of the Louisiana Purchase and was justified. I have affirmed that when the executive exceeds his legal powers, if no one protests, you will lose all of your liberties. The 4 steps in my pilgrimage, of them, the first occurred in Paris during the armistice after the 1914 war. I had had permission to go to Toulouse, and when I attempted to get back to London, I went to the consulate for my visa, the American consulate, and the whippersnapper back at the desk said that all Americans were to return to America. I pointed out that my means of livelihood, all my possessions, my flat, were in London, upon which he disappeared behind a partition, and a nasty little whining voice was heard saying, "We want 'em all to go back." The key words here are "we want." We want. The next man they were picking on was a naval captain who hadn't got some postage stamp or other on his leave to come to Paris for a fortnight. So we got into a taxi, the captain and I, and went around to the embassy. By 1,000,000 to 1 chance, the only American ambassador at that time who had had a law office, that is a wooden shack about 20 feet square, in the Rocky Mountains in 1885 to 6, was in Paris. And my father, who remembered him in the frontier days, a mild sort of frontier, but still Mr. Wallace at that time had jumped back into his shop to get his 6-shooter for a purpose from which my father dissuaded him. Dad had said, if you're in Paris, go in and say hello to Hugh Wallace. By the grace of God, I had gone in to see Mr. Wallace. I found a very elegant, very gentle, white-haired man sitting behind a desk, very gentle, very fatigued, and he asked if he could do anything for me, and I said, no. Dad said if I was in Paris to come in and say hello to you. So, not having needed anything the day before, when the naval captain and I arrived with our tale of woe, Mr. Wallace, Hugh Wallace, no relation of Henry, sent us a chit back to the consulate, and our visas and permits were put in order. My argument was that if these whippersnappers were trying to push me around, they were probably trying it on many other people. And I then began my campaign in the Paris edition of the Chicago Tribune against the passport nuisance, having wandered around Europe some years before with nothing in the way of cards of identity except an unstamped membership ticket in the Touring Club de France. Wilson, of course, in putting the $10 visa on passports, had penalized American students. The desirable or undesirable immigrant paid $10 to get into the U.S. The unfortunate American student who wanted to visit several countries in Europe got soaked from $30 to $50. The key word here was we want. The next item, I mentioned these troubles to a lanky ex-Dutchman by the name of Van Dyne, no relation of Mr. Willard Huntington Wright, who wrote detective stories with that pseudonym. Van Dyne had taken out his first nationalization papers, but not his second. He was called up for the Army, so he went before the tribunal in Chicago and said, I'm perfectly willing to fight in your army, but if I'm American enough to fight in your army, I got a right not to be taxed as a foreigner. He said the presiding officer leaned over the bench and said, Say, young feller, don't you know that in this country there ain't nobody has got any goddamn rights whatsoever? That is the second step. The third step, mentioning these two items to the prosecuting attorney for one of our largest cities, the comment offered was, all I'm interested in is bunk, seeing what you can put over. Angry K, all that I am interested in is bunk, seeing what you can put over. The discrepancy between this attitude toward the law and that of the Founding Fathers, the distance between Boston in John Adams' time and one of our larger cities in 1923 is considerable. I mentioned these 3 points to Senator Wheeler when I was in Washington in '39 trying to see if there was any way of staving off the war, which followed later that year. And Senator Wheeler's comment was, well, what do you expect? He's packed the Supreme Court, so they will declare anything he does constitutional. Now, that is where I took off from. When the senator is unable to prevent breaches of the Constitution, and of course, the senator, if he is not re-elected, is nobody, when the senator cannot function, the duty, as I see it, falls back onto the individual citizen. And that is why, after 2 years of wangling, when I got hold of a microphone in Rome, I used it.
The Italian radio, opinion by those who are qualified to hold it, following the tradition of Italian hospitality, has offered Dr. Ezra Pound the use of the microphone to license those against his conscience, or anything incompatible with his duties as a citizen of the United States of America. The President has no more legal right to do these infamies than you have to sign my name on a check or I yours. There is no darkness save ignorance. The Allies won that war and then cheated Italy. That was an error. The cheating of Italy was an error, and Lloyd George ought to know it back now. The cheating of Italy was an error. But that any sub-Jew in the White House should send American lads to die for the Jews and Sassoons, and the private interest of Singapore to die for British monopoly and brutality is not the act of an American sacrifice.
born in 1885 and died, I think, on the 1st of November 1972. What I'll do is I'll start by reading a poem that Pound wrote about the First World War and its effect upon that generation, which is known as Hugh Selwyn Morbally, and was written in around 1920. Part 4 of these interconnected stanzas that make up the work. These fought in any case, and some believing pro domo in any case, some quit to arm, some for adventure, some from fear or weakness, some from fear of censure, some for love of slaughter in imagination, learning later, some in fear, learning love of slaughter, died some pro patria, non dulce non et deco, walked eye deep in hell, believing in old men's lies, then unbelieving, came home, home to a lie, home to many deceits, home to old lies and new infamy, usury, age-old and age-thick, and liars in public places. Daring as never before, wastage as never before, young blood and high blood, fair cheeks and fine bodies, fortitude as never before, frankness as never before, disillusions as never told in the old days, hysterias, trench confessions, laughter out of dead bellies. Part 5. There died a myriad, and of the best among them, for an old bitch gone in the teeth, for a botched civilization. Charm, smiling at the good mouth, quick eyes gone under earth's lid, for too gross of broken statues, for 1,000 battered books. That's one of the more powerful and direct poems, or part of an overall poem, written by Pound, who was highly disillusioned by the Great War and the slaughter which eventuated. Indeed, it led to his break culturally with this country, which he'd lived in from around the turn of the 20th century. I think to give the talk some spine, it's best to adumbrate and look at the chronology of Pound's life. You have the birth in the United States to an establishmentarian family with Republican political connections and quite a prosperous family in the 1880s. You have the move to scholarship and to study English literature and medieval literature in particular, an obsession with the troubadour tradition and the poetry of the late Middle Ages, and a certain suppressed erotic and or other currents in European art. You have the move to Europe and teaching, the Polytechnic, various roundabout institutions, the writing for small magazines and small poetry journals, the befriending of almost every poet and or artistic intellectual who came to prominence during that period, Pound being a sort of unofficial clearinghouse and university for culture, the disillusionment in the wake of the Great War, the turning to the continent thereafter, the living in France from 1921 to 1925, and subsequently Italy from 1925 until 1945. The gradually increasing political radicalisation throughout the late 20s, 30s and 40s. After all, he was living in Mussolini's Republic. After 1945, imprisonment by the American authorities, the option to execute Pound for treason to the American Republic as designated, the option of life imprisonment, both of which were very real possibilities. Don't believe the rather tendentious and journalistic comment at the present time that says that Pound was really in no danger. The Americans would never have put one of the most foremost poets to death. There was a very real prospect of both execution and or life imprisonment, probably a slightly greater prospect of the second possibility. In the end, of course, he was institutionalised at St Elizabeth's Mental Hospital between 1948 and 1958. He then returns to Italy, 1958, through to the end. So you have that spine of the life, which, given that it was quite a complicated and diverse life, is best to keep in mind. Why was Pound regarded as an artistic revolutionary? Why is he inescapable from poetic modernism in the 20th century? Why hasn't he been dumped and binned because of his political affiliations? The reasons are essentially his concern with purity in language and the belief in the consolidation of literary forms and the compression of ideas into a smooth and unemotionally slithered diction, which he called imagism. And which which was to affect most of the poets of his era, including W.B. Yeats, who he befriended. I think Olivia Shakespeare, who was a flame of Yeats, had a daughter called Dorothy, who he later married. Pound was always rather complicated in his emotional and private life entanglements. He essentially had two families. He sort of had a Mark I wife, Dorothy Shakespeare. He had a Mark II wife, Olga Wright, and he had children, Omar and Mary, by both. And there are also other various mistresses as well. Poets were rock stars and were treated as such in the immediate pre-war period. Their doings, their mistresses, their outrageousness, their living against the conventions of bourgeois society were all considered to be integral to the poet's art. Pound advocated a revolution in poetics that gradually grew upon him from the first decade of the 20th century on, and was associated with poets like Hilda Doolittle, better known by her initials H.D., Virago published Hilda Doolittle's poetry, Amy Lowell, and various other people. He was also associated throughout the century with very, very major writers who would later campaign against his execution and imprisonment, whatever they thought of his political affiliations. These are people like Robert Frost, and above all, Ernest Hemingway. Pound was very much a product of the Protestant north of the United States, and remained, in a sense, a proud Yankee of independent birth and tradition. Many of his political positions are actually based on preceding incarnations of the American Republic, and this becomes increasingly evident during his life and during his work. The middle and latter stages of his career are dominated by the cantos, which is an enormous poetical book published in a series of stages, and including fragments that were published after 1969 as a sort of addendum to the same. Now, the cantos are his middle and late career. Other books, like Cathay and so on, are part of his early period. But what you see in all of his work is a concern with purity of tone, purity of pitch, solemnity and dignity of diction, the planing down of language, and in some ways a slightly Eastern use of Western language, which led him to explore Japanese and Chinese literature at a time that were virtually unknown outside of tiny sinological specialities and specialised university departments. Pound's poetry is very academic at one level and visceral at another. Philip Larkin once criticised Pound in a post-war way by saying he made poetry out of literature rather than out of life. True that Pound's poetry is fiendishly difficult. The cantos explores 15 languages, multi-dimensional realities, the idea of a hell that we're all in, a group of people that wishes to transcend that, and find, if you like, a terrestrial paradise, and enormous amounts of economic and political law, particularly in relation to the social credit theories of Douglas, that transfixed power from the 1920s onwards, and led him to believe that solutions to Western economic privation in the 30s were ready and were to hand. Now, Pound basically believed in a sort of cultural organisation. He believed in telling people what to write, how to read, what they should be reading. He managed to make sure that many of his associates were published and were put into galleries. He was extraordinarily important in the launching of the career of Wyndham Lewis, and in later theoretical and linguistic turns taken by W.B. Yeats. He launched a large number of poetical magazines which wouldn't have existed without him, and major works in the 20th century would never have been published without Pound, either as an editor, or as a midwife, or as a publisher's assistant, or somebody who even paid for the thing to be published in the first instance. The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, and most of T.S. Eliot's early poetry. He believed Eliot had modernised himself and got rid of romantic and what Pound considered to be effete diction. He planed down language to a modernistic absence of excess, and would not have been published without Pound's intervention. Ulysses by James Joyce would probably not have been published without Pound's intervention. Wyndham Lewis's Tar would not have been published without Pound's intervention. So Pound was extraordinarily important in fostering other talent. Artists are extraordinarily reluctant to support other artists because they're always involved in competition with each other. And there's a degree to which Pound was very unusual in his underground university attitude towards culture. This also went with his anti-democratic or elitist views. Pound basically believed in the absence of what has come to pass. He believed in a hostility to mass society, to mass entertainment, to mass infotainment, for the pop culture that emerged in and around and after the Second War, but was preceded by the Jazz Age in the 1920s as a sort of precursor of same. So what has actually occurred? Pound opposed from the moment of its inception. Pound believed that artists and writers and intellectuals and those associated with them had a mission to raise the level of the masses and to raise the level of mass culture. That culture, or the artistic implementation of culture, was a mould that the jelly of society should be made to fit. This led him in opposition to the idea that life is economically based and that all that matters is economic preferment, and that material good and material success is all that's important. And of course, during this period, the rise of commercialism, which now accedes to a totalitarianism and is all around us, was that which Pound and many other writers of the right, or the radical right, laid into. Pound was part of a generation that believed that Europe was dying and would either continue down to death or would be reborn. He hoped for the latter, and he saw in Mussolini's type of politics an adoption of the mechanisms and modalities of social credit. Social credit is, in all probability, a reasonably acceptable sketch for an alternative type of economics. Pound invested it with Holy Writ and really did believe that there was the prospect of building a social credit society where money served the consumer and served the producer, and where the middleman based upon usurious interest-bearing profit without work or prior motivation could be cut out. This drew both Douglas to a minor degree and Pound in a much more lurid and extravagant and artistically extreme way into what we might call politely the rejection of philo-Semitism. Pound was a brave man and was prepared to suffer for his ideas, and was driven to a certain extent. If you consider that he was in many ways a one-man dynamo, because he contradicted the establishment, into a minor element of which in the United States he'd been born himself, on most major fronts in the 20th century. He opposed the literary and cultural values of the pre-Second World War and post-First War establishment. He opposed neo-Edwardianism and traditional romanticism in verse and sought for a modern alternative. He opposed economic and social doctrines which were widely prevalent at the time. He had a look at certain forms of authoritarian socialism in socialist and alternative magazines like the New Age, which he wrote for in the second decade of the 20th century, edited by the occultist or the occult interested writer A.R. Orridge. He explored ideas of re-evaluation and currency reform and economic transformation of Western societies to get rid of the merchant and to get rid of the trader and to get rid of the banker and to get rid of the financier as the major arch or linchpin for that which existed. It's not that these societal models and roles didn't have any veracity whatsoever. It's that Pound believed that they should not be central to a culture or a civilization. Otherwise, the values inherent in a culture will rot away. Usury, which is what he used to describe this sort of debt-based finance capitalism, which is the system which prevails, which is the system that has worked, stroke not worked, which has staggered on throughout the 20th century with recurrent crises, seeing off its state socialist, authoritarian socialist, and in some respects social democratic rival models. Pound lived until 72 and advocated maximal reform in the 1920s, 30s and 40s. Pound was the most politically active poet since William Blake. In an average year, he wrote 1,000 letters to various administrators, statesmen and senior politicians. He was always berating politicians, and he always sought personal contact with them. Just as with the artistic community, when he arrived as a young student, sort of American immigrant, in and around the turn of the latter years of the first decade of the 20th century, Pound went directly to source. If he wanted to meet the putative imagists like A. Bilal and Hilda Doolittle, he would go and do so. Now, became the most notorious poet of the 20th century through a concatenation of forces. Certainly on the 26th of July 1943 he was in absentia indicted for treason by the American government, and this was for broadcast which he made on Mussolinian state radio. The Italians were reluctant to allow Pound to the radio. He had to fight for quite a long time until they allowed me near that damn microphone, as he would have said. The passion that the Pound case involved is difficult to understand in contemporary terms.
Don't shoot him! Don't shoot the president! Assassins deserve worse, but don't shoot him! Just which of you are free from Jewish influence? Just which political and business groups are free from Jewish influence? From Jew control? Who holds the mortgages? Who is the dominating director? Just which Jew has dominated?
Arthur Miller wrote a long article in which he speculated upon the tortures that he would like to see inflicted on Pound prior to execution, and this was published in the published prints. The emotions that were generated by the traitor Ezra, whom was described by Miller as worse than Goebbels, who knew how to appeal to every American strand of prejudice. Most of these broadcasts were never heard, but they were certainly heard by the American elite and by the American cultural elite. The irony is that Pound had so many friends culturally, from Hemingway down, that he was awarded the Bollingen Prize by the Library of Congress immediately after the Second War, which caused absolute outrage in the United States. Not being for his lawyer campaigning for an insanity plea immediately post-war, he would have probably faced life imprisonment, and if it had not been for the enormous number of prominent artists and writers, people like William Carlos Williams, people like E. Cummings, people like Robert Frost, people like Ernest Hemingway, many of whom had no time for Pound's political views. If it had not been for them campaigning on his behalf, he could well have had a much stickier end. Pound broadcast until the Americans invaded Italy after Operation Torch. Pound was arrested by partisans. The partisans had killed the Mussolinis a day or two before. But interestingly, the partisans seemed to know who he was and knew that American intelligence wanted to interview him. The interesting thing was he was released initially into the care of his family and was then taken back into American custody. The second phase of American custody was the most climactic, because in Pisa he was put in the death cells, as they were called. The death cells were 6 foot by 6 foot steel cells. He had little water, few toiletries, there was no belt allowed, there was no shoelaces allowed, threat of suicide of course. Pound was put in this cell for 2.5 weeks and gradually either went partially mad or did go mad for a short period. He was in extreme heat. You were denied all cultural stimulation and the guards were told not to talk to the prisoners. The only individual you could actually communicate with was the chaplain. There is a lot of evidence that Canto 86, I believe, was started in the Pisan cells, because he started the Pisan cantos, one of the most famous sections of the cantos overall, in the death cell, which shows a sort of mental resilience and a commitment to culture, even in the harshest conditions, when he either faced insanity, death, being left in the death cell until there was literally nothing left. It was only when he was interviewed and assessed by a psychiatrist that he was taken out of the death cells and put in medical confines. He then was interviewed by J. Edgar Hoover's personal representative, who'd opened a file on him in 1943, pursuant to the treason trial which would occur. The attempt by his literary friends to have him declared insane was essentially a ruse or a cultural route that was adopted primarily to save his sanity, paradoxically, and his life. Whether Pound actually crossed the line into partial insanity at certain times, at St. Elizabeth's, where he was incarcerated in a mental institution for 10 years between 1948 and 1958, is difficult to determine. Certainly, Pound was driven, and he once said that Wyndham Lewis, his old friend, was pursued by the Furies, but Pound himself was in certain respects a man who was pursued by the Furies. The cantos, which is as thick as a sort of telephone directory, and which is published by Faber in Britain, is a strange work because it has no ultimate plot or overall structure, rather like Pound's work, which which tends to be a cluster of heightened images, often pared down, involving enormous cultural resource of language, where one idea suggests another one somewhat effortlessly, and where you have to, rather like with Blake, realise that an internal world, an internal soundscaping language, a visual world in many ways, and a highly cultured one, is being illuminated in tropes and in artistic configurations. That's the only way really to read Pound. It doesn't have an obvious narrative sense. It all associates with the need for a renewal in culture, the extraordinary importance of the troubadour, the heightened medieval and the classical tradition of the ancient world, the importance of culture to be raised over money in all areas of national life, the importance of the past in the present and the future, but the commitment to the future and the commitment to an explicitly modern future, but not the modern future that we live in now. Pound's growing disgust at the forces which he believed held back art and civilization and were planning for a new war. One of Douglas's ideas, much more radical than Keynes in this respect, is that a debt-laden economy which needs endlessly to spend in order to produce and then clear more and more debt, which in turn will be spent through, in a circular way, leads to war. He believed the control of economies by bankers and financial capitalist institutions and the subordination of industrial and agricultural productivity to same will lead to war, what the extreme left in the 1960s called the welfare warfare state. These are sorts of statements which were made by Marxist and Frankfurt School intellectuals like Herbert Marcuse in books like Wonderful Young Man in the late 1960s. Now, because of course radical right and extreme left share certain assumptions or share certain ideas if they radically critique finance capitalism in particular and the nature of a contemporary economic order. Pound was never an orthodox conservative and was essentially opposed to liberalism, except in the humanistic sense, except in the sense of a wide and deep educativeness. Other than that, he was opposed to liberalism in politics and believed in enlightened aristocracy and rule by the talented few. He was opposed to liberal enlightenment views in culture because he believed in a culture-bearing strand and elite which fed down into the masses and tried to raise them up to the level that they could reach given their natural aptitudes and abilities. And he was also opposed to money choosing the politicians that one has. In most Western societies you have two blocks, as everyone here knows, one representing bourgeois electoral power, one representing working class electoral power. They occasionally overlap in the centre, but they basically vie with each other to manage the system best as boards, but increasingly are powerless in relation to the money that seems to determine both their ideas, their foreign policies, and even the personnel of that runs these parties. It was increasingly difficult to say whether contemporary politicians actually run these societies. The left-wing concepts of the ruling class that doesn't rule, the sort of rudderless ship, a system that is a process in and of itself, are developments which occurred after Pound's death. But what he critiqued in the 1930s, particularly with the Roosevelt administration, which you could argue had moved via the New Deal to Keynesian demand management and to certain forms of radical economic activity and initiative, very unusual for an American regime, which might be to Pound's liking. But Pound saw a poisonous relationship between the United States and the rest of the planet. While not strictly speaking an isolationist, Pound was a European American in the most radical of senses. Pound believed that American culture was an extension of European culture, not the other way around. And he also believed that Americans should contribute to Europe and to the glory and continuity of European culture as represented by the still living and extant cultural spaces of Italy and Greece. A romantic of the European South, Pound believed that the task of great writers and intellectuals was to lead people and was to instill in people a belief in the glory of their civilization, something which almost all contemporary artists have given up on. Pound remains uniquely controversial in 20th century letters, and no matter how many little magazines he founded, no matter how many poets that he led to being published, no matter how many artists he got into galleries, no matter how important his own work, the politics that he became associated with is what has doomed him in the eyes of the culture-bearing strata. Although there's a degree to which, because modernism in letters, in the English language at any rate, cannot exist without him, there is a degree to which Pound remains cardinal to the poetic experience in the 20th century. This is why every modern literature course in any British or American university or further afield has Ezra Pound as a key item within it. But Pound can only be talked about in hushed tones and in tones which attempt to apologise for his past, liberally, revisionistically explain away his past, or honestly confront his past, as in John Title's biography of Pound, without necessarily belabouring the criticism too much, because academics can get away with a certain specious objectivity. One of the most famous biographies of Pound, of course, is written by Eustace Mullins, the quite well-known right-wing currency reformer, advocate of alternative economics, conspiracy theorist, and American writer in the post-war era. These friendships, which he had with people like John Caspar and with Eustace Mullins, would be held against Pound and were indeed used as a way of preventing him from leaving St Elizabeth's mental hospital until 1958. Ernest Hemingway always campaigned for Pound's release, gave him £1,000 on the moment he got out of St Elizabeth and went back to Europe. When Pound returned to Europe, the first gesture he did when he got off the boat was to give, in front of waiting journalists who were there to receive him, was to give the fascist salute. And said that, he said, "I've left America, and America is an insane asylum." Everyone in America is mad. So by leaving America, I have left an asylum. Anti-Americanism didn't begin with Pound, but it certainly didn't end with him. And yet he would actually proclaim himself to be a proud American, loyal to Republican and Federalist ideas, which go back to the founding of the Republic, belief in standards of family and behaviour, the belief in a post-European culture and identity in the Americas, a belief in hard work, a belief in the frontier ethics, a belief in the sort of lumberjack sort of ideal of the United States, which is not corrupted and polluted by fiscal capitalism. In some ways he wants a simple, ruralist, idealised US. Now Pound recovered gradually and used St Elizabeth's Hospital as a sort of moral university. Most of his family, his two families if you like, visited him there. A large number of writers and intellectuals visited him there. Wyndham Lewis once complained that your strategic initiative in taking up residence in a lunatic asylum is not healthy. And although it was quite clearly the strategy which enabled him to survive and prosper in the post-war world. My view is that one thing that people should always look at are the elite artists and intellectuals who've aligned themselves with European renewal. Educate yourself, read for yourself, read and make decisions for yourself, turn the television off and look at this sort of material. Ezra Pound is an example of Anglo-American intellectuality and poetic resourcefulness at a very high level. Even the critic George Steiner once said of Pound that he had an extraordinary ear, this ear for language. He believed that artists were the antennae of the race, and that they were there to lead other people towards a greater understanding of what it is to be human, a greater understanding of what you're going to experience before you die, when you wonder whether your life's been worth anything or not. These are the sorts of areas that Pound wishes to reach into. So I would ask people to admire this man, not just because he had a political affiliation that people in this room would find much more acceptable than the average representative of Radio 4 culture, but also because he's an elitist of the best sort and a mind of the best sort that we rarely see today. A polymath who was unafraid, and he walked in a manner that led people to recognise that irrespective of his Americanism, this man was a European. Here goes a man, here goes a great European American. I give you the memory of Ezra Pound, 1885 to 1972.
What thou lovest well remains, the rest is dross. What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee. What thou lovest well is thy true heritage, whose world, or mine, or theirs, or is it of none? First came the seen, then thus the palpable Elysium, though it were in the halls of hell. What thou lovest well is thy true heritage. What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee. The ant's a centaur in his dragon world. Pull down thy vanity. It is not man made courage, or made order, or made grace. Pull down thy vanity, I say, pull down. Learn of the green world what shall be thy place in scaled invention or true artistry. Pull down thy vanity, back and pull down. The green cask has outdone your arrogance. Master thyself, then others shall thee bear. Pull down thy vanity. Thou art a beaten dog beneath the hail, a swollen magpie in a fitful sun, half black, half white, nor knowst thou wing from the tail. Pull down thy vanity. How mean thy hates, fostered in falsity. Pull down thy vanity, wraith to destroy, niggard in charity. Pull down thy vanity, I say, pull down. But to have done instead of not doing, this is not vanity. To have with decency knocked that a blunt should open, to have gathered from the air of live tradition, or from a fine old eye the unconquered flame, this is not vanity. Here error is all not done, all in the diffidence that faltered,